Welcome back to the deep dive, where we take what seems like the most intricate, perhaps even dry topics, and unearth the surprising vital insights hidden within. Today, we're plunging into a subject that, while sounding quite technical, is absolutely foundational to our modern digital lives: international data transfers. Okay, let's unpack this. When we talk about international data transfers, it might conjure images of, servers humming in distant lands, but it's actually at the very heart of how our globally interconnected world functions, especially when it comes to personal privacy. Think about your daily routine. Every time you shop online from an international retailer, stream content, use social media, or even just send an email, chances are your personal data is crossing national borders. In this era of a, digitally borderless world, understanding how this incredibly sensitive data moves, and maybe more importantly, the strict rules governing its journey, isn't just crucial for big multinational corporations. It's vital for you, the individual, to comprehend how your digital footprint is managed. So, our mission in this deep dive is to unravel the complexities outlined in Chapter 12 of European Data Protection, focusing specifically on Europe's meticulous and, let's be honest, often controversial approach to moving personal data across these national and international boundaries. And we really owe a debt of gratitude to the author of this insightful chapter, Eduardo Ustaran, for setting such a clear and crucial stage for this discussion. #1, understanding the why behind international data transfer rules. So let's start with what might seem like a fundamental tension within the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. On one hand, the GDPR clearly states its objective to ensure the free flow of personal data between member states within the European Union and the wider European Economic Area, which makes perfect sense, right? The EU is designed as a single market, free movement of goods, services, capital, people. Data should follow suit, you'd think. But then, almost in the same breath, the GDPR introduces a crucial caveat. It recognizes transfers of personal data to third countries require special consideration. And that immediately sparks a big question for me. Why? Why this special consideration? Why isn't data simply allowed to flow freely everywhere, given that our digital lives are so interconnected, so inherently global?
That is the foundational tension, isn't it? And what's truly fascinating here is how the GDPR, like the European data protection philosophy that actually predates it by quite a bit, attempts to balance these two seemingly opposing goals. You've got facilitating the seamless global digital interactions that, define our modern world. But at the same time, rigorously protecting individual privacy when data crosses those borders. It's a delicate dance, really, and it lies at the very core of modern data law. And this isn't a new concept, not something just born with the GDPR in 2018. It's fundamental to European data protection philosophy, going back decades to the Data Protection Directive 9546/EC and even earlier. The core idea, which has remained absolutely steadfast, is that when personal data leaves the European Economic Area, the EEA, it needs to maintain an equivalent level of protection.
Equivalent level of protection. Okay, what does that mean in practice? Does the other country need a law exactly like the GDPR?
Ah, good question. No, not exactly identical, word for word. That would be practically impossible, right? Different legal traditions, different constitutional setups, different cultural views on privacy versus, say, national security. Instead, equivalent means their legal framework, taken as a whole, has to achieve a comparable outcome. It's about safeguarding individual rights and freedoms, especially that fundamental right to privacy. So they need things like independent watchdogs, supervisory authorities, and effective ways for people to get justice if their rights are violated, effective judicial remedies. And crucially, clear, proportionate limits on government access to personal data. It's really about ensuring your privacy isn't compromised just because your data physically moves somewhere else.
Yeah. So it's not about mirroring the GDPR precisely, but achieving the same level of protection, the same safety net for the individual. That makes a lot more sense. And you mentioned the roots go deeper than just GDPR into fundamental rights. Can you expand on that a bit? Why is it framed as a fundamental right?
Absolutely. And this is key to understanding the whole European approach. Europe views data protection not just as, say, a consumer protection issue or a regulatory hurdle for business. It's seen as a fundamental human right. This perspective is deeply embedded in key legal instruments. You've got the European Convention on Human Rights, the ECHR, which protects the right to private and family life, and then even more specifically for data, Article 8 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union. It explicitly states, everyone has the right to the protection of personal data concerning him or her. And it goes on, data must be processed fairly for specific purposes with consent or another legitimate basis, and people must have rights like access and correction. So your personal information. It's seen as an extension of your private sphere, deserving robust legal safeguards, just like your physical property or your freedom of speech.
Okay, so that framing changes everything. It's not just about bits and bytes. It's about human dignity.
Precisely. So when data leaves the EEA, the profound concern is it might land in places where those fundamental rights aren't protected to the same high standard, or where enforcement is weak, leaving individuals vulnerable. The source we're looking at highlights that this area has attracted significant controversy over the years exactly because it touches on these deep principles: sovereignty, privacy, fundamental rights. It's not just compliance checklists. And it absolutely remains a key area of focus for the compliance efforts of most organizations. Why? Because the implications of getting it wrong are severe. We're talking not just hefty fines under GDPR, but also damage to public trust, to reputation. It forces organizations to constantly ask not just where data is going, but crucially, what happens to it when it gets there. They need to ensure those fundamental rights don't just evaporate at the border. It's a proactive responsibility. ###22. The legislative pillars for international transfers.
That context on the why, the fundamental rights underpinning, is incredibly important. It really frames the entire discussion, doesn't it? So given this deep-seated commitment to safeguarding fundamental rights and ensuring that equivalent level of protection, how does the GDPR actually translate that philosophy into actionable law? The source calls it a challenging restriction in our digitally borderless world. It outlines 3 primary conditions that must be met for transferring personal data outside the EEA lawfully. Can you walk us through these conditions? What do they really mean in practice for businesses and for us as individuals?
Right, these 3 conditions are the legislative pillars, the legal gatekeepers for international data flows. They're designed to make sure that data, once it's outside the EEA, still benefits from protections comparable to those within the EU, maintaining that continuous chain of protection. So the first condition is adequacy decisions. This is essentially a determination made by the European Commission. They look at a specific third country, meaning a country outside the EEA, and decide if it ensures an adequate level of protection for the personal data.
An adequacy decision. So the commission does the heavy lifting, the assessment.
Exactly. And it's an extremely thorough, in-depth assessment. They scrutinize the country's domestic data protection laws, its rule of law, its respect for human rights, also the existence and effectiveness of its independent supervisory authorities, the data watchdogs, and critically, the access its public authorities, particularly intelligence agencies, might have to keep to data. That's become a huge focus. If, after all that digging, they find the standards are comparable to EU standards, then bingo, the country gets an adequacy decision. And that means data can flow almost as freely to that country as it would within the EEA. It's like a pre-approved, safe destination for data.
Like a trusted partner status for data.
You could put it that way, yeah. For example, countries like Japan, New Zealand, South Korea, Canada, they received adequacy decisions from the EU. This really streamlines transfers for businesses dealing with those countries.
Okay, so an adequacy decision is like the golden ticket for data transfers. If a country has one, you're largely good to go. Makes sense. But what happens if a country doesn't have that golden ticket? Or, I suppose, if one gets challenged or revoked later, that must be where the next condition comes in.
Precisely. If a country doesn't have an adequacy decision, or if it's absent or, as has happened, challenged and invalidated, then the second condition comes into play: appropriate safeguards. This applies, as the text says, in the absence of that adequate level of protection. Here, the responsibility shifts. It falls squarely on the controller or processor wishing to transfer the data to provide these safeguards themselves. This means putting in place legally binding commitments, promises essentially that ensure the data will be protected to EU standards, even though it's in a country without that overarching adequacy decision.
So the company transferring the data has to build the safeguards itself.
Well, the crucial elements here are that enforceable data subject rights and effective legal remedies for data subjects are available. That's the core requirement. It's not just about signing a document. It means individuals whose data is transferred must genuinely be able to exercise their rights, like accessing their data, correcting it, deleting it, and they need real recourse to justice if their data is misused, even if it's processed abroad.
Like consumer rights, but for your data privacy abroad.
That's a great analogy, yeah. If your data is misused overseas under one of these safeguards, you must have genuine practical ways to demand action and even challenge violations in court, no matter where the company is based. Now, the main practical tools for this are standard contractual clauses, or SCCs, and binding corporate rules, or BCRs.
SCCs and BCRs. Okay, let's break those down. What are SCCs?
Standard contractual clauses are pre-approved sets of contractual terms. They're issued by the European Commission, typically templates. They legally oblige the data exporter, the company in the EEA, sending the data, and the data importer, the company outside the EEA receiving it, to adhere to specific GDPR-like standards for that transferred data. They're designed to create a sort of contractual bubble of protection around the data as it
The
travels.
bubble of protection. I like that.
Yeah, but, and this is a big but we'll get into later, simply signing an SEC isn't always enough anymore. Especially after court rulings, companies often need to take extra supplementary measures to make sure that equivalent level of protection is truly maintained in practice, particularly if the laws of the receiving country might undermine those contractual promises, like allowing broad government access.
Ah, okay. So SCCs are a key tool, but maybe not a complete solution on their own in some cases. What about the other one? BCRs.
Right? Binding corporate rules. These are a bit different. They're essentially internal codes of conduct used by big multinational corporate groups for their intergroup international data transfers. Imagine a large global company, maybe a tech firm or a bank, with offices and operations all over the world. Data is constantly flowing between its different entities. Instead of using SECs for every single internal transfer between its subsidiary in Germany and its HQ in the US, for example, the entire group can get a single set of BCRs approved by EU data protection authorities.
So it's like a company-wide data transfer passport?
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
But getting them approved is a rigorous process. The authorities need to be convinced that the BCRs legally bind all entities within the group, wherever they are, to uphold strict EU data protection standards. Once approved, these BCRs allow data to flow freely within that corporate group worldwide. It's a robust and efficient solution for complex internal transfers within large multinationals. It shows a serious commitment to data protection across the board.
That makes sense. SECs more for external transfers, BCRs for internal group transfers. Got it. So what about the third condition? If there's no adequacy decision and appropriate safeguards like SCCs or BCRs aren't feasible or in place, is that it? Is data transfer impossible?
No, not necessarily impossible, but very restricted. That brings us to the third pillar, derogations for specific situations. These are quite distinct from the first two. They are explicitly exceptions to be used only in the absence of an adequate level of protection or of appropriate safeguards. It's really crucial to understand these are not meant for routine, systematic, or large-scale transfers. They are not a loophole. The GDPR specifies these derogations for specific situations, meaning they are narrowly defined and intended only for very particular limited circumstances. Think of them as a legal safety net for truly exceptional cases.
Okay, so what counts as an exceptional case?
Well, the GDPR lists several. For example, one common one is if an individual has given their explicit consent for a very specific transfer, after being fully informed of the risks involved because there aren't adequate safeguards. So you really have to know what you're agreeing to.
Explicit consent, knowing the risks. Okay, what else?
Another key one is if the transfer is necessary for the performance of a contract between the individual and the controller, or for pre-contractual steps taken at the individual's request. So if you sign up for a service and delivering that service absolutely requires your data to be processed by a company outside the EEA, and you requested that service, this derogation might apply. Emphasis on necessary.
Necessary for the contract.
Right. Other derogations cover transfers necessary for important reasons of public interest, or for establishing, exercising, or defending legal claims. Maybe your data is needed for an international court case you're involved in. And also, transfers necessary to protect the vital interests of the data subject or another person, especially when they can't give consent. Think medical emergencies abroad. But the key takeaway, the absolute main point here, is that these derogations are a last resort. They have to be interpreted strictly. Only used when no other mechanism fits, and the transfer genuinely meets one of these narrow exceptions.
Last resort only. Got it. That really reinforces the message, doesn't it? Protection is the default.
Exactly. This high bar reinforces Europe's commitment. Data protection is the rule, not the exception, even when data crosses borders in our very connected world.
That's a critical clarification. It paints a picture of a very structured, layered approach. So we've outlined the philosophical why, the fundamental rights, and the legal how, these three pillars. Now, let's turn to a real-world scenario that has perhaps been the most contentious, most dynamic illustration of these rules in action, the transfer of data between the European Union and the United States. ###3. The contentious case of data transfers to the United States. Right, these legislative pillars provide the framework, but as you said, their real-world application can be incredibly complex, sometimes fraught with legal challenges. And nowhere is this more evident, or has it attracted more headlines, than in the large volume of data transfers carried out between the European Union and United States. This has historically been a really high-stakes relationship in the data protection world, and frankly, a pretty contentious one, marked by legal battles and attempts at new frameworks. Let's dig into that history and where things stand now. Hashtag 3.1, the original Safe Harbor framework.
Indeed. The EU-US data transfer relationship is a perfect case study of these complexities and the constant evolution or maybe revolution in data protection law. It all started really with the original Safe Harbor mechanism. This framework was initially developed cooperatively. You had the U.S. Department of Commerce and the European Commission working together back in the early 2000s. Its primary purpose was to create a self-regulatory framework. The idea was that U.S. organizations could voluntarily sign up, self-certified that they adhered to a set of privacy principles designed to meet EU data protection requirements, specifically for those transatlantic transfers.
Self-certification, so companies basically promised they'd follow the rules.
Essentially, yes. They committed to principles like notice, choice, onward transfer, security, data integrity, access, and enforcement. And based on this self-regulatory approach, on 26 July 2000, the European Commission actually issued a decision saying that, yes, the Safe Harbor privacy principles did provide adequate protection. That effectively gave the green light for data flows from the EU to U.S. companies that had self-certified under Safe Harbor.
Okay, so it was meant to be a streamlined path, a sort of data bridge across the Atlantic. But you mentioned earlier it was fraught with challenges. What went wrong, what made it so contentious, and what ultimately caused its collapse?
Here's where it gets really interesting, and where that core tension between national security surveillance laws and fundamental privacy rights really exploded. From the very beginning, Safe Harbor was indeed fraught with challenges. Despite that initial adequacy decision, concerns grew over the years about how effective it really was. Did it genuinely guarantee an equivalent level of protection once data hit U.S. shores? Critics, including privacy activists like the Austrian lawyer Max Schrems, argued the self-regulatory nature lacked teeth. Not enough independent oversight, not enough enforcement.
So doubts about whether companies were actually doing what they promised?
Partly that, yes, but the real bombshell came in 2013. The revelations by Edward Snowden about extensive U.S. government surveillance programs, like PRISM. These revelations fueled massive fears. Fears that data transferred to the U.S., even under Safe Harbor, could be accessed by U.S. intelligence agencies pretty easily, without adequate safeguards, without proper judicial oversight, and crucially, without effective ways for non-U.S. citizens to seek redress if their data was swept up.
The Snowden effect.
Right.
That changed the conversation globally.
Absolutely. And these simmering tensions boiled over into a landmark legal challenge brought by Max Schrems against Facebook Ireland, relating to its transfers to Facebook in the U.S. under Safe Harbor. This led to the Schrems ruling of October 2015. The CJEU, the Court of Justice of the European Union, the EU's top court, delivered a seismic blow. It flat out invalidated the Commission's decision that Safe Harbor was adequate.
Wow. Just invalidated it after 15 years.
Just like that. Invalidated. It wasn't just a legal defeat for the framework. It fundamentally shifted the landscape. The court basically said that the Commission hadn't properly assessed whether the U.S. actually ensured adequate protection, particularly in light of potential government surveillance. The CJEU found that the framework did not adequately protect EU citizens from potential indiscriminate surveillance by U.S. authorities. It highlighted the lack of effective legal remedies for Europeans whose data might be accessed. This ruling demonstrated powerfully that contractual promises or self-certification aren't enough if the broader legal environment of the receiving country doesn't uphold fundamental rights to the EU's standard.
So the assessment of adequacy isn't just about a company's policies. It's about the whole country's legal system, especially government access.
Precisely. It was a profound moment, underscoring Europe's unwavering commitment to its fundamental rights approach to privacy. And it threw transatlantic data flows into chaos. Hashtag 3.2, the Privacy Shield Framework, 2016-2020.
That invalidation of Safe Harbor must have created an immense void, just huge uncertainty for thousands of businesses relying on those transfers daily. How did the EU and US respond to that immediate crisis? They must have scrambled to put something new in place, right?
Oh, absolutely scrambled. The invalidation left companies in a very precarious legal position, basically overnight. They needed a new legal basis fast. So the EU and US rapidly negotiated and introduced a successor framework, the Privacy Shield Framework. This was adopted in 2016. Privacy Shield aimed to be a more robust version of Safe Harbor. It incorporated several improvements specifically designed to address the concerns the CJEU had raised about Safe Harbor.
Okay, so what was different about Privacy Shield? What were the upgrades?
Well, for instance, it introduced stronger obligations for U.S. companies regarding how they handled data. There was increased oversight promised by the U.S. Department of Commerce and the Federal Trade Commission, FTC. And critically, it established an ombudsperson mechanism within the U.S. Department of State. This was meant to be a dedicated channel for EU individuals to lodge complaints about potential U.S. government access to their data. It also mandated an annual joint review by the EU and U.S. to check if it was actually working effectively.
So more oversight, stronger company rules, and this ombudsperson thing for complaints about government access. Did it work? Did it calm the waters?
Well, for a while, yes. Privacy Shield became the primary mechanism for many companies transferring data across the Atlantic. It provided a legal basis. However, those underlying concerns about U.S. surveillance laws, they never really went away, especially for privacy advocates like Max Schrems. He filed another legal challenge, this time arguing that Privacy Shield, despite its improvements, still didn't provide that equivalent level of protection.
Deja vu. What was the argument this time?
The core argument remains similar. U.S. intelligence agencies could still access EU citizens' data in ways that didn't meet EU standards of necessity and proportionality. And, crucially, the ombudsperson mechanism. It wasn't seen as providing sufficient judicial remedies. It wasn't a court. This led to another landmark ruling, Schrems II, in July 2020.
At Schrems II. Okay, here we go.
Exactly. And in this second seismic decision, the CJEU once again invalidated the EU's data transfer framework. This time, Privacy Shield. Gone. The court reaffirmed its previous concerns. It found that the broad powers of U.S. intelligence agencies and the lack of effective judicial remedies for EU data subjects whose data might be caught in U.S. surveillance were incompatible with fundamental rights under the EU Charter, specifically Article 7, Privacy, and Article 8, Data Protection.
So 2 frameworks down, Safe Harbor, then Privacy Shield. Both struck down by the EU's top court over U.S. surveillance concerns.
Precisely. And the Schrems II ruling had an even broader ripple effect. It didn't just kill Privacy Shield. It also cast serious doubt on the use of standard contractual clauses, the SCCs we talked about earlier, because the court underscored that any transfer mechanism, whether it's an adequacy decision or SCCs, has to ensure protections against third-country government access that are essentially equivalent to EU standards.
Yeah.
You can't just sign a contract and hope for the best if the local law undermines it. Hashtag 3.3, the evolution to 2021 standard contractual clauses, SCCs.
Okay, so after Safe Harbor, then Privacy Shield, both invalidated by the CJEU on these fundamental rights grounds. Businesses faced another period of, well, immense uncertainty again. This clearly necessitates adaptable legal tools. And this is where the 2021 Standard Contractual Clauses, or SCCs, step into the spotlight, right? The European Commission adopted this substantially revamped version of the SCCs in June 2021. And you're saying these new SCCs were a direct response to Schrems II, aiming to fix the problems highlighted by the court.
It's exactly. The 2021 SCCs are a direct and, frankly, quite sophisticated attempt to provide a robust and flexible mechanism in the wake of that Schrems II judgment. A key improvement, highlighted in the chapter we're discussing, is their modular approach. This offers greater flexibility because data transfers aren't one-size-fits-all, are they?
Modular approach. What does that mean? Like different versions?
Precisely. Instead of the older, more rigid SCCs, the new version is structured with 4 distinct modules. Parties select the specific clauses relevant to their particular data transfer relationship. You've got Module 1. This is for controller-to-controller transfers. Think 2 independent companies sharing data, both deciding how it's used. Maybe an EU company sharing customer data with a U.S. marketing partner.
Okay, controller to controller. Got it.
Then Module 2. This handles controller-to-processor transfers. This is incredibly common. An EU company, the controller, hires a service provider outside the EEA, the processor, to process data on its behalf. Think cloud storage, payroll, CRM systems.
Right, like using a U.S. tech provider.
Yeah.
Very common.
Then Module 3. This is for processor-to-processor transfers. This covers situations where that first processor, maybe an EU IT provider, needs to subcontract some processing to another processor outside the EEA, like the processor for data storage in the US.
Okay, so chains of processing.
Exactly. And finally, Module 4. This is less common but still important. Processor-to-controller transfers. This is when data flows from a processor in the EU back to a controller located outside the EEA. Now, the significance of this modularity isn't just neat organization. It forces companies to really think about and define their roles, who's the controller, who's the processor, and the nature of the transfer.
So it encourages better data mapping and understanding.
Yes, which often reveals compliance gaps they might have missed. And it simplifies compliance because you use the precise module that fits your situation, leading to more targeted and effective safeguards rather than a generic approach.
That modularity sounds incredibly practical, especially for businesses trying to navigate this complexity. But the huge challenge, as you explained from Schrems II, was always about government access and lack of remedies. How do these new SCCs directly tackle those specific concerns about surveillance?
That's the absolute crux of it. The 2021 SECs directly address the Schrems II concerns by adding, and this is key, a number of provisions that strengthen the ability of the contractual parties to control the extent to which government agencies outside the European Union may access personal data.
Okay, how do they strengthen that ability? What do the clauses actually require?
Well, it implies new proactive obligations, particularly for the data importer, the company outside the EEA receiving the data. For example, the clauses now require them to take specific steps if they get a government request for data transferred under the SCCs. These steps include things like Comodato, 1, transparency. They generally have to inform the data exporter, the EU company, about requests for the data, unless they're legally gagged from doing so.
So telling the EU company if the government comes knocking.
Basically, yes, where possible. 2, challenge. The importer is required to assess the legality of the request and challenge it if there are grounds to believe it's unlawful or overly broad. They can't just roll over.
I have to push back.
They have to assess and potentially push back, yes. And 3, risk assessment. This is crucial. Before even using the SCCs for a transfer, organizations are now effectively required to conduct what's called a Transfer Impact Assessment, or TIA.
At TIA, what's that involve?
It means they must assess the laws and practices of the importing country, specifically looking at whether those laws, especially around government access, might undermine the protections offered by the SCCs themselves. If the TIA reveals that the SCCs alone aren't sufficient to guarantee that equivalent level of protection in that specific country context, then they must implement supplementary measures.
Supplementary measures,
Yeah.
extra protections on top of the contract.
Exactly. These are additional technical, organizational, or contractual safeguards. Technically, this could mean strong encryption, maybe end-to-end, or pseudonymization, making the data less identifiable. Organizationally, it could involve things like stricter internal access controls or specific training for staff handling requests. Contractually, it might mean adding even more specific clauses to the agreement beyond the standard SCCs.
So it's a much more dynamic, risk-based approach now, not just signing a form.
Precisely. It ensures that even when using these standard contracts, the fundamental rights of EU data subjects are robustly protected against potential foreign government overreach. It makes the SCCs a more adaptable tool. And the source concludes that because of these advancements, the modularity, the explicit provisions on government access, the TIA requirement, the supplementary measures, this set of SCCs remains a strong and reliable mechanism for all types of international data transfers. They're designed to be resilient. Hashtag 3.4, the current EU-US Data Privacy Framework, DPF.
Okay, so the 2021 SCCs provide a strong contractual route, especially with these new requirements for TIAs and supplementary measures. That sounds like a solid option. But the whole history of EU-US data transfers has been this back and forth, trying to establish an overarching general mechanism like Safe Harbor, like Privacy Shield, to simplify things, especially for smaller businesses maybe. Given that Privacy Shield was invalidated back in 2020 by Schrems II, what's the current state of play for those general systemic data transfers between the EU and the US today? Has there been another attempt at an adequacy decision?
That's the absolutely essential question for anyone dealing with transatlantic data flows right now. And yes, you guessed it. Following the Schrems II invalidation of Privacy Shield, the EU and US went back to the negotiating table yet again. They worked to establish a new framework, and this culminated in the EU-US Data Privacy Framework, or DPF. This framework was finally adopted as an adequacy decision by the European Commission on July 10, 2023.
July 2023, so relatively recent. This is the current successor to Safe Harbor and Privacy Shield.
It is. The DPF is the latest attempt to restore a stable, general legal basis for data transfers from the EU to U.S. companies that participate in the framework again. It involves self-certification by U.S. companies. and it's specifically designed to directly address the concerns raised by the CJEU in the Schrems II second ruling, particularly those two big sticking points: U.S. government access to data and the lack of effective redress for EU citizens.
Okay, so how does the DPF try to fix those specific problems? What are its key features?
Well, firstly, regarding government access, the U.S. government made commitments, including through an executive order. These commit to implementing new safeguards that limit access to data by U.S. intelligence agencies to what is necessary and proportionate to protect national security.
Necessary and proportionate. Those are key terms in EU law, so trying to align the language and the practice.
Exactly. It's meant to signal a move away from the concerns about bulk or indiscriminate surveillance that plagued the previous frameworks. Secondly, and this is a big one, for redress, a new two-layer mechanism has been established for EU individuals. This includes the creation of a Data Protection Review Court, or DPRC.
A court, not just an ombudsperson.
Yes, the DPRC is intended to be an independent body with powers to make binding decisions and order remedies if it finds violations by U.S. intelligence agencies involving EU individuals' data transferred under the DPF. This aims to provide that effective judicial remedy the CJEU found lacking before. And thirdly, the framework maintains robust oversight mechanisms by the U.S. Department of Commerce and the FTC to ensure U.S. companies actually comply with the DPF principles they sign up to.
Okay, so strengthen limits on surveillance access and this new Data Protection Review Court for redress. That sounds like a significant evolution from Privacy Shield, directly targeting the CJU's stated concerns. Does this mean the saga is over? Is the era of legal uncertainty for EU-US data flows finally finished?
Well, that is the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it? While the DPF is definitely a substantial step forward, and it provides much-needed legal certainty for now, it's important to be realistic. It faces ongoing scrutiny. Max Schrems and his organization, NOYB, stands for None of Your Business, have already indicated their intention to challenge the DPF before the CJEU, just as they successfully challenged Safe Harbor and Privacy Shield.
So Schrems III is potentially on the horizon.
It seems very likely. Their primary argument will probably revolve around whether these new safeguards, particularly the DPRC and the definitions of necessary and proportionate, truly meet the standard of equivalent level of protection guaranteed by the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights. They might argue the DPRC isn't a real court in the judicial sense, or that the limits on surveillance aren't strong enough in practice. So while the DPF is currently operational, it's the primary mechanism many rely on, and it offers a strong legal basis today. The story of transatlantic data transfers is, in many ways, still unfolding. It's a fascinating real-time example of the dynamic interplay between technology, global business needs, and those fundamental human rights in the digital age. Businesses are using the DPF, but everyone's watching closely for potential future legal challenges. Vigilance remains key.
That's a really comprehensive overview of the EU's persistent efforts and that very contentious history of data transfers with the U.S. It's quite a saga. But of course, the geopolitical landscape has shifted significantly elsewhere too, particularly with Brexit. The U.K. is now outside the EU. So how has that impacted international data transfers, specifically for transfers originating from the United Kingdom to other jurisdictions? How does the U.K. handle this now?
That's an excellent and crucial point to bring up. The UK's departure from the EU did indeed create a new legal separation here, even though the UK largely kept the GDPR's principles in its own domestic law, now known as the UK GDPR. So for transfers from the United Kingdom to other jurisdictions, the UK's Data Protection Authority, the UK Information Commissioner's Office, or ICO, has developed its own specific mechanisms. The main one is the International Data Transfer Agreement, or IDTA. This was adopted on 21 March 2022.
The IDTA, so the UK's own version of SCCs, essentially.
Pretty much, yes. It serves a very similar purpose to the EU's standard contractual clauses. It's a contractual tool to ensure appropriate safeguards are in place when personal data leaves the UK for a country without its own adequacy decision from the UK government. But it's specifically tailored to the UK's legal framework, the UK GDPR. Now, alongside the standalone IDTA, the ICO also introduced something quite practical, an addendum to the EU's 2021 SCCs.
An addendum, what does that do?
It's quite clever, really. It allows UK organizations that are already using the EU's 2021 SCCs for transfers, maybe because they operate across both the EU and UK, to simply attach this UK addendum. The addendum essentially modifies the EU SCCs just enough to make them legally valid and binding under UK law for transfers from the UK.
So UK businesses have two main options. Use the UK's own IDTA or use the EU SCCs plus this UK addendum.
Exactly. This dual approach provides flexibility while ensuring that data transferred from the UK maintains appropriate protections, reflecting the UK's independent but ultimately very similar approach to data protection post-Brexit. And just like the EU, the UK is also working on its own adequacy decisions for certain countries, recognizing countries whose standards it deems equivalent.
Has the EU recognized the UK in return?
Yes, importantly, the EU has granted its own adequacy decision to the UK. This means data can generally flow relatively freely from the EU to the UK because the EU recognizes that the UK's data protection standards, largely based on the GDPR, are currently equivalent.
Okay, so there's a complex web, but mechanisms exist for UK transfers too. It shows how legal frameworks have to adapt to political changes while trying to keep that core goal of data protection intact.
Absolutely. It's another example of how these legal instruments adapt to political realities while striving to maintain that fundamental objective of robust data protection. Outro.
Wow, what an intricate journey we've taken through Chapter 12 of European data protection and this whole labyrinth of international data transfers. We've truly covered a lot of ground today. We went from the core philosophy behind these rules, rooted so deeply in fundamental human rights, all the way to the very practical, constantly shifting mechanisms that actually make our global digital world function.
It's definitely a complex area.
Yeah. So just to recap, the core challenge driving all this, it remains that delicate balancing act. How do we facilitate the essential free flow of data, which our modern world relies on, while also ensuring robust privacy protection for individuals? We broke down those three main legislative pillars the GDPR provides for sending data outside the EEA. First, those adequacy decisions, the Commission's stamp of approval for a country's standards.
The gold standard, if you can get it.
Right. Second, appropriate safeguards, like the much-talked-about 2021 standard contractual clauses, those SCCs, and binding corporate rules, BCRs. These are used when there's no adequacy decision, relying on strong contractual and organizational promises. And third, derogations for specific situations. Those narrow last resort exceptions for very particular limited transfers, not for everyday business.
Definitely not for routine stuff.
And we really saw, didn't we, through that whole contentious history of U.S. data transfers, the fall of Safe Harbor after Schrems I, the fall of Privacy Shield after Schrems II, and now this new EU-U.S. data privacy framework, the DPF, we saw how key court rulings have just profoundly shaped these mechanisms time and again.
Driven by fundamental rights concerns.
Exactly. Those decisions have continually forced legal frameworks to evolve, to adapt, pushing constantly for stronger protections for your personal data, even when it crosses borders. This legal landscape for data transfer, it's like a living, breathing thing, constantly reacting to new tech, new politics, and maybe most importantly, new interpretations of fundamental rights. So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Well, it means that behind every click, every online purchase, every social media post that connects you globally, behind those interactions that feel completely borderless, there's an incredibly complex, painstakingly developed, and continuously evolving legal framework. And this framework is working tirelessly, often unseen, to ensure your personal data, no matter where it travels, remains protected to a high standard. It's about safeguarding your fundamental rights, even when that data is physically far away.
It's a testament to the idea that privacy isn't just a local issue anymore. It's truly global, requiring constant vigilance from everyone involved, governments, companies, and individuals too. That's a perfect summary. This whole journey through international data transfers, it really does reveal that while technology makes our world feel borderless, the law is perpetually working to define and protect those very borders, at least when it comes to our personal data. And it remains one of the most dynamic, legally scrutinized, and just plain high-stakes areas of data protection. It demands constant vigilance, constant adaptation from organizations all over the world. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? As new transformative technologies like artificial intelligence continue to reshape how data is collected, processed, moved globally, often in ways that are far more complex, maybe less visible than traditional transfers. How will these fundamental principles, these existing mechanisms like adequacy and SCCs, continue to adapt? How will they hold strong in the face of this ever-increasing complexity? Will we need new adequacy decisions that specifically consider AI risks? Or maybe new modules for SCCs tailored to the unique data flows in advanced AI systems? The evolution is definitely not over.
That's a fascinating final thought. The core challenge of balancing innovation with fundamental rights is only going to get more intense, isn't it? It's a living, breathing area of law, constantly trying to keep pace. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into international data transfers. We really hope this exploration has given you a clearer, perhaps more profound understanding of this vital, if complex, aspect of our digital lives. We encourage you to continue exploring these critical topics. Until next time.